You probably heard about Hans Niemann using anal beads to cheat in chess.
And now fans speculate Niemann had an accomplice who was watching the game being broadcast live online and consulting an AI chess program, then using wireless anal beads that vibrate to Niemann the correct moves.
It went viral. Actually, this whole story started as an offhand joke by a chess commentator after Magnus Carlsen, the current world champion. He declared that Hans Niemann had cheated, but he never said how Niemann cheated. Let me be clear here. We don't for a minute think that Niemann used anal beads to cheat in his game against Carlsen. In fact, we don't think that Niemann cheated in that game in specific against Carlsen. Instead, we think that this whole story offers a really nice entry point about a very deep philosophical puzzle about what it means to play a game. And the puzzle is just this. When we think about playing a game, what it means to play a game, what are the defining features of playing a game? It's very tempting to define it as following the rules of playing the game. Suppose Niemann was cheating throughout his game with Carlsen. So let's suppose that the crazy beads theory was true. That means that he was not following the rules, right? That means that he was breaking the rules. And if you break the rules, are you playing the game? Maybe Carlsen thought that he was playing against Niemann, but actually he was playing against the Niemann's computer. So it wasn't really Niemann. Niemann was like a proxy agent for the computer. So Carlsen was indeed playing against the computer, right? That makes sense. But in another sense, Niemann was there. He was actually moving the pieces. And there are rules for the tournament. And the rules for the tournament is that if you cheat, it's considered as a loss. And it should be counted as a victory for Carlsen. And this matters to the tournament result and their ratings. But again, you can't lose a game you didn't play. I interviewed Professor Michael Rage of the University of Edinburgh, who has developed a systematic theory to address this issue. I interviewed Professor Rage about his paper, How to Play Well with Others, which was published in a volume edited by Thomas Hurka, University of Toronto, called Game, Sports and Play. Now, this is a bit longer interview because we go into more detail over his argumentation and how his theory can address many other issues in this topic as well. So, Professor Ridge, can you tell us how you got the idea for this theory?
Thanks. I teach a course at Edinburgh each year called Philosophy, Fun and Games, and I found the main existing theories of playing games problematic. And it gave me an idea for a theory that I thought could preserve what I thought was really plausible and interesting in those theories without inheriting their problems. One of the problems, though not the only one, was what those theories have to say about cheating, as in that crazy Carlsen-Niemann story. So I guess I should start by saying a little more about why I found existing theories problematic. The most famous philosopher to discuss how to define play a game was Wittgenstein. He took the rather disappointing view that it just can't be done, though, at least not in the classical way of giving a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. Wittgenstein used this to illustrate his own broader family resemblance theory of how words like game can get their meaning. But that's a long story, and I think probably better saved for another occasion. Bernard Suits, in his classic and highly influential text, The Grasshopper, argued that Wittgenstein gave up too quickly, and that it is possible to define play a game. His definition has 4 parts: the game's goal, which, as I'll explain, can be understood in 2 ways, the means for achieving that goal, the rules of the game, and finally, what Suits calls the illusory attitude. So first, there's what he calls the pre-illusory goal. That's a goal that can be understood independently of the game. In golf, for example, the goal might be just getting the ball in a cup. But the illusory goal can be understood only in terms of the rules of the game. So the illusory goal in golf would be getting the ball in the cup, but only using golf clubs in such and such permitted manner, and with as few strokes as you can manage. The rules make the activity more difficult by ruling out certain means, for example, just dropping the ball in the cup by hand. This fits with Suits' view of what's valuable about games. They provide us with opportunities for achievement, which is basically overcoming challenges with skill. The rules make it harder to achieve the goal, and that provides the challenge to be overcome. Finally, there's what Suits calls the illusory attitude, which combines all the other elements of his definition elegantly. To have the illusory attitude, you have to adopt the rules of the game for the right sort of reason in order to participate in the kind of activity that they make possible. And each time I taught this material, I was struck how, despite this definition's many advantages, it has the striking implication that if you're cheating, then you're not playing the game at all. This is because it is part of the definition of playing a game that you follow the rules. But cheating, by definition, means breaking the rules. Furthermore, If someone is not trying at all to win the game on Suits' theory, Suits calls this trifling, then by definition, they're not playing the game. Remember, pursuing the goal is part of the definition of what it is to play a game. I found both of these implications problematic. Now, to his credit, I have to admit, Suits spots these implications and follows the argument where it leads, but I just don't think it's very plausible.
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking here of how I reply to someone when they're not really playing the game, when a trifler. Usually I think I'll say something like, hey, come on, let's play the game. And I think that implies that they are not really playing the game.
Actually, I agree in one sense that it's true, but in another important sense, they're playing the game. I'll come back to the sense in which they are not playing the game later, once I've told you something about my own theory. First, though, let me explain why I think it's clear that in at least one useful sense of the phrase play a game, you can cheat while you play a game. An interesting case to consider is what, in my paper, I call the inveterate cheat, somebody who cheats throughout a game. Gaylord Perry, for example, apparently cheated his whole career by throwing spitballs in baseball, which is against the rules. However, it would be crazy to say that Gaylord Perry never or almost never played baseball. He's in the Hall of Fame. And that example is not unique to me. It's been discussed in the literature. Yet, it seems to be an implication of Suits' theory that he never played baseball, at least unless we supplement it with another meaning for the phrase play a game, and say that in a different sense he was playing baseball. I also think that most speakers would consider sentences of the form, Jones cheated me in our poker game last night. He was using a marked deck, and so he was cheating the whole time. But Jones has never played poker in his life. Incoherent, or at least very weird. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? Like a misuse of language to say someone cheated at a game they never played in their life. Yet Suits' theory entails that such claims can not only be meaningful, coherent, but actually true. If the guy was using marked deck the whole time, and has done so every time he ever played poker, then he's never actually played poker. We should say every time he supposedly played poker.
I'm remembering here that in the paper you also discuss playing games in more formal settings, like in a chess tournament, and that reminds me of the Carlsen-Niemann craziness.
Yes, I'll come back to the Niemann example later. I'm fond of chess, so tournament chess also sprang to mind when thinking about these issues, to me at least. Suppose someone showed up at the board at a chess tournament, made 2 illegal moves in a row, and thereby lost the game. Under current international rules, 2 illegal moves entails a loss. It's important that it's scored as a loss and not a default, as in when you just don't turn up. With a loss, you not only lose the game for purposes of determining your rank in the tournament, you also lose rating points on your international rating as a chess player. So that distinction between losing and defaulting matters. Now suppose after the game is declared a loss for me, I go up to the arbiter of the tournament with my copy of Suits' The Grasshopper in hand to lodge a formal complaint. I could say, look here, Mr. Arbiter, this prominent philosopher says, if you break the rules, then you aren't playing the game at all. And I did. I broke them the whole time. Both my moves were illegal. So I never played that game of chess. But of course, it's trivial that you can't lose a game you never even played. So you can't coherently judge this quote-unquote game to be lost. Give me back my rating points, sir. Well, all I can say is good luck with that appeal.
Well, fair point. There does seem to be a sense, at least in certain contexts, where you can count as playing a game even though you broke the rules.
Yeah, that's right. I think the hypothetical version of the Carlsen-Niemann scandal, in which Niemann actually was, contrary to fact in my view, cheating the whole game with anal beads, does not lend itself naturally to the sense of play a game in which you can cheat while playing the game, but for an interesting reason. In that case, there's another very salient opponent, namely Niemann's computer. And that makes it very tempting for ordinary speakers to think that Carlsen was quote-unquote really playing the computer and not Niemann, without realizing it, of course. If all Niemann did was take the computer's advice on every move, then he contributed no more than, say, a robotic arm would, after all, really. But not all cases of cheating are like that. Often there will be no other agent you can point to and say, that's who you were really, quote-unquote, playing. But even in this hypothetical version of Niemann that we're considering, Beady Niemann, we might call him, I think the sense is there. It's just a bit unnatural. Suppose this was the only time they encountered one another over the board, and someone said, well, Carlsen's never played Niemann. I think that's at best very misleading. But I think it'll be easier to think about cases like this one once my positive theories have been laid out. So let's put this kind of weird case to one side for now. You can also use chess to make a similar point about trifling, about playing without trying to win, which is a conceptual impossibility on a theory like Suits's. In fact, I think this is probably an even better objection than the cheating one. Suppose somebody made totally random moves in a tournament game of chess, making absolutely no effort to win whatsoever, just making sure that their moves were legal. According to Suits, they never played the game. But look, they might accidentally get a checkmate position on the board if their opponent was really terrible. I think in that case, we would say that they won the game. And in fact, any competent arbiter at a chess tournament would agree. They would insist that they won the game. But you can't win a game you never played. Winning a game surely entails that you at least played it. So again, there seems to be a sense of play a game in which you can play a game while trifling. But Suits' theory entails that this is impossible trivially. So Suits' theory, I think, is vulnerable to two powerful objections. First, you can cheat while playing a game, but his theory says you can't. Second, you can trifle while playing a game, but his theory says you can't.
Yeah, I'm very interested in cheating and trifling, and I don't know, maybe in the future we can do more videos on this topic in specific.
Yeah, I agree. There are actually some really cool analogies between this worry about Suits' theory and a classic objection to Kant's moral theory that it would be fun to discuss. Anyway, these objections got me thinking about how to improve on Suits' theory. But I should add that the objection is not unique to Suits. It applies to any theory which makes following the rules or pursuing the goal constitutive of playing the game. That is, being what it is to play the game in part. And it's very tempting to do something like this, I have to admit. After all, games very plausibly are made up by goals and rules. Or more broadly, perhaps, instead of rules, we could say obstacles. The most obvious way to relate a player to goals and rules is to stipulate that they must pursue the goal and follow the rules. The challenge is to see how we could define play a game in a way that still gives prominence to both rules and goals, but which understands the player's relation to rules and goals in some other logically weaker way, some way that doesn't entail actually following the rules and pursuing the goal. But it's far from obvious how to do that, and so I think it's no coincidence that so many theories in the literature that try to define play a game follow Suits in insisting that to play a game you have to follow the rules and try to achieve the goal.
But hold on, do you really need to reject Suits' definition? Because for all you have said so far, his definition might provide one useful sense of play a game. We just need to articulate a second sense to handle uses of the phrase play a game in which we want to say cheaters and triflers are not playing, since you agreed that in one sense they are not.
In principle, no. But I had another worry about Suits' theory that made me think his definition is flawed, even if we overlook the worries about cheating and trifling. In fact, this objection was the basis for the title of my paper, How to Play Well with Others. Suits' theory neglects the social aspect of many games. Suits' theory is formulated in an entirely first-personal way. Other people are conspicuous for their absence from his definition. But it's a very important point that many, if not most, games played with other people, opponents or teammates. Of course, there are single-player games too, like solitaire and countless computer games, and I'll come back to that. But for multiplayer games, Suits' theory simply has nothing to say.
Couldn't he just say that a multiplayer game is one where the goal of the game refers to other people in the right way? For example, perhaps not just deliver checkmate, but deliver checkmate to my opponent.
Perhaps, but then we need to know what makes someone count as your opponent. It certainly won't do simply for the illusory goal to refer to another person in some way. Here's an example from my paper that I used to make this point. One time I was running late for the Edinburgh Chess Club for a match. I was on foot and jogging to make up lost time, and I noticed I was roughly keeping pace with a bus. Now don't jump to the conclusion that I'm a very fast runner. I'm not. The bus had to make a lot of stops and there was a fair bit of traffic. Anyway, I decided it would be a nice challenge to see if I could get to the point at which the bus and I parted ways before the bus. It ended in a draw. So in one sense, I was playing a game with another person, the bus driver. The driver could figure in a statement of the illusory goal, if you like, to get there before the driver does. But in another sense, I wasn't playing with the driver. He wasn't my opponent. Imagine how weird it would be if I boarded the bus at the end and started taunting the driver over his quote-unquote defeat if I'd gotten to that point before him.
Yeah, you would be playing with the driver like the same way you would play with your knight in chess or with the ball in football.
Exactly. Although my goal involved another person, the bus driver, it was really a one-player game. So we need our definition to make room for distinguishing playing with someone as an opponent, or a teammate, say, and playing with them as something more like a playing piece. This is made more vivid in certain exhibition chess games in which the pieces are represented by actual human beings, perhaps in costume, dressed up as bishops or knights or whatever, and move in accordance with the two players' wishes.
And I guess Suits' theory does not lend itself naturally to drawing that distinction, right?
Not really. I go through some ways you might try to extend his theory in the paper, but I won't go over all those details here. My own approach took inspiration from what was missing in my race with that bus driver example. Suppose we modify the story so that at the outset, I hop on the bus briefly and I tell the driver, I bet I can get to Princess Street before you, mate. And the driver then replied, you're on. On that version of the story, it does seem like the driver was my opponent. So that suggested to me that what we really need is something like a social contract or a mutual agreement, what I call commitments undertaken by me and my opponent, but where a commitment is a kind of speech act, a kind of agreement.
Well, in your example, it sounds plausible, but I'm thinking here that people don't really make explicit verbal agreements every time they play a game, right? I'm just thinking it's possible to play a game with other people without the explicit verbal agreement.
Absolutely, and that's why it's crucial that the commitments can be implicit and nonverbal. In the paper, I give an example that I take from Dave Gorman's humorous book, Dave Gorman versus the World. Gorman happened on someone playing a form of clumsy solitary ping pong in the park. And here's how he relates what happens next. Quote, he smiled shyly, as if embarrassed at being discovered in his strange solitary pursuit. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Instead, I instinctively drew my hand out of the bag and held the bat aloft for him to see. It proved to be the opening line in what I think was my first ever conversation, to be held in the silent medium of table tennis bats. His smile changed, no longer embarrassed. I waved my bat from side to side. His bat beckoned me into the square. Now, as it happens, Gorman and the other player did later verbally agree to play a game, which spoils an otherwise perfect example. But we can imagine that they didn't. And in this imagined version of the example, I think it is clear enough how they still communicated their commitments to one another without actually using any words. And that's the sort of thing I have in mind when I say you can undertake commitments in the way that makes the case that you're playing a game without any actual overt verbal behavior.
Yeah, I can see how that flexibility does make the commitment approach more plausible. But undertaking the commitment isn't sufficient for playing a game, right? I'm thinking here about the sufficient and necessary conditions. What other necessary conditions need to be met for a group of people to play a game together?
That turns out to be tricky. The temptation is to say that in addition to undertaking the relevant commitments, the players must both, at the agreed time, follow the rules and try to win. But that gets us right back to my objections to suits, that on their views, triflers and cheaters can't count as playing the game.
Yeah, I can see how that can be a problem, since it's not obvious what other behavior would suffice, and you need to add something to just undertaking the commitment.
Yes, I agree. It isn't as if a promise to play a game with someone is impossible to break, because once you've made the promise, you've already started playing and kept the promise.
Okay, so what other necessary conditions did you end up adding?
I started out by defining what it takes to play a game. Note that you can have spent some time playing chess, for example, without ever having played a game of chess. If you stop playing before the game is over, you played some chess, but you didn't play a game of chess. Semantically, quote, play a game of chess is like walk to the store. You can have been playing a game of chess without your having played a game of chess. If you adjourn the game and never return to it to finish it, for example, or you die in the middle of a game, to take a more morbid example. This is like the case of walking to the store. You can have been walking to the store without having walked to the store. If you turned back before you got to the store, because of rain or whatever, then you were walking to the store, but you didn't walk to the store. Anyway, my theory therefore needs to incorporate the distinction between playing chess and having played a game of chess in some way too. But I start with a simpler case where a full game is played. This means a result, that is, a win, loss, or draw, is fixed. One thing that must happen before we can say a game took place is that the players must show up. Or anyway, enough of them must show up for quorum. Much like a meeting doesn't start until enough people show up. What counts as enough is going to depend on the details of the game, of course. Furthermore, showing up has to be understood pretty broadly so as to include online or virtual games. But I think it's clear enough what showing up means in those cases intuitively, logging on the right way or whatever. And for an entire game to have been played, an end point must be reached. That is, the state of play must reach a point such that no further play is allowed by the rules and a result is determined, win, loss, or draw. So there are four conditions really. First, the players have to commit to following the rules. Second, they must commit to pursuing the goal. These conditions are the heart of the theory really, the social contract. Third, they have to show up, or at least enough of them do. And fourth and finally, an end point must be reached. Notice that this theory relates players to rules and goals without insisting that they follow them. This is how the theory meets the challenge of defining play a game in terms of rules and goals, without insisting that you follow the rules and pursue the goal to count as playing the game. The players are related instead via a commitment to do these things. But you can break a commitment. You can break a promise. And that's what the cheater and the trifler do.
Yeah, it sounds like it may be tricky explaining what counts as reaching an endpoint, win, loss, draw, whatever. One that presupposes that the players follow the rules, since an endpoint is defined by following the rules until a result follows, right?
Not really. We can draw a distinction between the state of play as officially recorded on a scoreboard or as taken implicitly as valid by the players on the one hand, and the state of play as defined by a position reached through a series of actually legal moves on the other. If you trick somebody when you're cheating, then they'll take the score to be other than it is, and in that sense, that is the score for these purposes. That ambiguity allows for an endpoint to be reached in one sense, the first of the two I laid out, even though the players were cheating. So long as the official scoreboard or the player's shared understanding reflects the endpoint, or the opponent takes the moves at face value and considers an endpoint to have been reached, that will suffice for an endpoint to have been reached in one sense.
Okay, but that then is going to require you to say something about what makes the activity of the other players count as actually playing the game.
Yes, and I need to say something about that anyway, to give an account of what constitutes playing a game at a point in time, as opposed to having played a whole game. It turns out doing this will also allow me to explain how, in another sense, you aren't playing a game if you're cheating or trifling.
Yeah, having it both ways.
Yes, but on a principle basis. We do think about activities like playing games in two very different ways. Here I need another distinction. Fortunately, it's one that can be independently motivated. It's a distinction that applies to activities associated with a socially recognized role, where that role is constituted by certain norms and goals. Suppose somebody's enrolled as a doctoral student in philosophy from, say, 2009 until 2014. In one sense of the phrase, pursuing a PhD, that's enough to make it true that from 2009 until 2014, that person was pursuing a PhD. If at the end of 2014 we asked how long they had been pursuing a PhD, it would be natural simply to say 5 years. In another sense, though, we might say the person has not been pursuing their PhD for 5 years. Suppose my interlocutor replied to my claim that the student was pursuing a PhD for 5 years by saying, "Oh, really? Even though we're eating, sleeping, or at the cinema?" Now, this reply is pedantic and super annoying, but it's annoying in part because there's some truth in it. On one reading of doing a PhD, they weren't doing their PhD for the whole 5 years. This is what I call in the paper the rule-following sense. In another sense, though, they were doing their PhD the whole 5 years. They occupied the social role of PhD candidate for the entire period, and so were bound by the norms constituting that role. Norms, for example, prohibiting plagiarism. This is the sense in which my postgraduate office would classify the student as a fifth-year student. And they were also thereby committed, by their agreement with the university, for 5 years to the goal of completing their dissertation, subject to following those rules against plagiarism, for example. I call this the normative role sense of doing something. Here's another example to illustrate the idea. Chairing a committee. If I occupy the role of committee's chair and I show up at the designated time for the meeting, and enough others do too if it's quorum, then in one sense I will count as chairing the meeting, no matter what I do. After all, the meeting's taking place and I'm the chair. Suppose, though, that I flagrantly violate the norms governing chairing meetings. I ignore parliamentary procedure. I interrupt people at one point, or I dance around the room singing, "I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy." In the rule-following sense, I'm not chairing the committee. My colleagues could quite naturally say, "Come on, Mike, quit fooling around and chair the committee." But in the normative role sense, I am still chairing the committee, even as I dance around the room, just really badly. After all, I still count as the committee's chair, and then I could be held accountable for the norms of a committee chair. If I wasn't the committee's chair, then I couldn't be blamed for what I was doing, at least not blamed for being a bad chair. I apply this distinction, rule following versus normative role, to the phrase playing a game. The cheater and the trifler are still playing the game in the normative role sense, just as I would be in that committee example when I acted crazy. They're still bound by the rules of the game, even as they violate them, and they're still committed to trying to win, even as they don't make any effort to do so. So in that sense, they're still playing the game. But they are not playing the game in the rule-following sense, unless they are at the board following the rules and making at least some effort to achieve the goal. But if they're cheating, they're not. So in one sense, you have to follow the rules and try to achieve the goal to count as playing the game, the rule-following sense. But in another sense, the normative role sense, you can play a game without meeting those conditions. I give some other examples in the paper and I elaborate on the distinction, but that's kind of the core idea. Now, if we return to the Beatty-Neiman example, The idea would be that just as I'm still the chair of a committee, even if I'm dancing around like a maniac, breaking all the rules for chairing a committee, Neiman would still be Carlson's opponent. He would still occupy the social role of Carlson's opponent, even if he was breaking all the rules too, with his beads. And to be his opponent in a game of chess just is to be playing a game of chess with him. That follows from the concept of being someone's opponent in a game. Likewise, he would deserve censure and the loss precisely because he was playing the game. It isn't like he didn't show up, and he still exercised agency in deciding whether to follow the computer's advice. He's still accountable for that. And as I said before, this example is tricky. I said this much earlier in the interview because there's the presence of another agent, the computer, and we want to say Carlson's really playing the computer. But I think that just kind of confuses things, and I think really what we should say is, in one sense, Carlson played Neiman, and in another sense, he didn't.
All right, so now you have a distinction between two senses of play a game, and you can make sense of the idea of cheating and trifling while playing a game, while at the same time allowing that in other sense, you are not really playing the game unless you follow the rules and try to achieve the goal. I can see how that theory evolved in response to what you saw as the shortcomings of a theory like Suits. So I guess that's the full theory, right?
Actually, no, I'm afraid not. In a way, I cheated in laying out the theory before talking about the rules and the goal when defining play a game. That was a cheat because implicitly I really meant the rules and the goal of the game. After all, not all rules and goals, even when related to each other in the right way, with the rules making it hard to achieve the goal, make up a game. For example, conducting a just war is governed by moral rules and has a constitutive goal, to defeat the enemy. But it isn't literally a game. War is distinct from war games. I need to explain what makes a rule-goal combination count as a game practice, or my definition will really be circular implicitly. I'll be using the concept of a game to define play game by helping myself to some unanalyzed concept of a game rule. I take a functional approach to characterizing game rules and goals. Only practices with the right functions count as game practices. The function of a practice is what it is for in an intuitive sense. In the same way that a chair is for sitting on, Twister, the game, is for having fun, let's say, for example. Now, someone might at this point object that social practices aren't the right kinds of things to have functions, but I disagree. Functions are fixed by something's history, or rather its place in a broader history of things of that kind. In some cases, functions are fixed by the person who made the thing. A chair is for sitting because the person who made it did so with that function in mind. That applies to some games with a specific game designer. In other cases, functions are fixed by the history in another way, by the explanation of why the practice proliferated over time. The evolutionary history of hearts, for example, explains why the function of a heart is to pump blood. That is why hearts proliferated in various species, not because they made a thump-thump sound, for example. With games, the relevant evolutionary history will be cultural rather than biological. But we can explain why certain games persisted over time by appealing to how much fun they are, or by how they gave people a chance to achieve something, or any of several other functional explanations. So the question then is just which functions qualify a social practice as a game practice? What does something have to be for to count as a game? And here my views are a bit more tentative. I'd have liked to have a simple and unified view. One such view would be, for example, that the function must be to provide people with an opportunity for structured play, where play can be understood independently of games, maybe in terms of having fun. I have a whole other theory of that, actually. But ultimately, I think any such unified theory is going to be too narrow, because games do a lot of different things for us. Different games have different functions. Some games are less about being vehicles for playfulness and acting silly or having fun, and more about chances for something like exhilaration, as with, say, high-stakes gambling, or opportunities for achievement, as with a lot of sports and games of skill like chess. So in the paper, I take a more pluralist view of the functions that make something count as a game. The relevant functions will include being playful, having fun, providing opportunities for achievements, socializing, exhilaration, and perhaps others as well. If these functions figure prominently in explaining why the social practice proliferated over time, then it counts as a game practice. Otherwise, it doesn't.
This seems like a place where philosophy could learn something from other disciplines. I'm thinking here of anthropology or cultural studies.
Yes, I agree. We can learn a lot about which functions make people classify something as a game by considering a wide range of paradigm examples, and this should be informed by the relevant empirical facts.
I do have one worry about this theory, because I'm thinking here that the theory builds on commitment as a speech act. So speech act goes into the definition of playing games. And that works very well for multiplayer games. But what about single player games? What about playing solitaire, for example? Do I make a promise to myself not to break the rules?
No, that seems very strained to me. I think we need to posit another ambiguity in the phrase play a game to handle single player games. In the paper, I argue that the phrase play a game is context sensitive and that the topic of a conversation tends to fix its meaning. If we're talking about multiplayer games, then the definition I've been laying out so far in this interview is the one that applies. If, however, we're talking about single player games, then another definition is in play, pun intended. And that definition is a lot closer to Suits' definition than the one I've been discussing so far. I don't think single player games necessarily involve commitment, if by commitments we mean speech acts, even tacit ones. Interestingly, though, we sometimes use the phrase undertake a commitment in a sense which does not involve communicative acts. In another sense, someone has undertaken a commitment simply by setting themselves a goal, right? If I take on the goal of becoming a better chess player, in a sense, I've committed myself to improving my chess game. Perhaps we should say that when you play a single player game, that this consists in part in undertaking a commitment in this taking on a goal sense. Single player games do still have goals, after all. You need something which makes the goal difficult. These might be rules, but they could be obstacles in some broader sense, like the ghosts in Pac-Man are obstacles, but not rules. So I then say you're playing a single player game if you carry out a commitment and intention to overcome the goals which constitute the game, where that game also imposes obstacles on achieving that goal. Games are still understood as practices with functions as they were in the case of multiplayer games.
Well, that sounds an awful lot like Suits' simpler definition of gameplay as the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles.
Yes, I think Suits was close to right about single-player games. He just overgeneralized by taking his definition to apply to all games, including multiplayer games. However, even as applied to single-player games, there is a difference between my theory and Suits' theory. The main difference is that my theory has that functional component still. This allows me to still avoid the kind of overbreadth worries that I mentioned before, treating conducting a just war as a game, for example.
But what about your objection that Suits' theory make it impossible to play the game while cheating or while trifling? Won't that also apply to your definition of single-player games? Because here in single-player games, you don't seem to have the same distinction between normative role and rule following, and you instead just make rule following necessary for playing the game.
It does have that implication, but I don't think it's damaging in this context. That's because I think this reflects a genuine difference in how we think about single-player games as opposed to multiplayer games. If we're playing poker and I peek at your cards, I'm still playing poker in one sense, but I'm cheating. If I'm playing solitaire and I start rearranging the deck to make it easier for myself, then I don't really think I'm cheating in any interesting sense because I don't really think I'm playing the game any longer in that case. I think the concept of cheating arises precisely in interpersonal cases, and this because cheating is in part a moral concept, or at least a concept we think is very morally important. Compare cheating on your exam or cheating in a relationship. In both cases, it's only cheating because you're breaking a commitment to someone else, your partner, the university, and so on. And I think this tracks well with ordinary thought. I think most people would say, once you stop following the rules or stop trying to achieve the goal, you stop playing solitaire. End of story. I think precisely because they are shared social activities, we have a different set of concepts for thinking about multiplayer games.
I think I get the big picture now. You posit an ambiguity in play a game as between multiplayer games and single-player games. While Suits was almost right about single-player games, he left out the functional aspect, he was wrong about multiplayer games. For multiplayer games, you need the idea of commitment and the distinction between playing a game in the rule-following sense and playing it in the normative role sense. You have also highlighted some of the advantages of your theory. Unlike Suits, it can handle multiplayer games and the idea of playing with someone as an opponent. It can make sense of the idea that cheaters and triflers are, in one sense, still playing the game. And it's not overbroad in the way Suits' theory is. The functional condition can avoid counterexamples like conducting a just war. So I guess that my last question is, does your theory have any other major advantages?
I canvass a few other advantages in the paper. In brief, I think it not only explains the possibility of cheating, it also explains why cheating is morally wrong. Cheating isn't just pretending to do something you aren't. It's also a betrayal. In English, at least, we even use the same word in the case of having an affair. Though that's not really essential to my point. And as I learned in a previous discussion with you, some languages like Portuguese aren't like this. Anyway, my account can better explain why cheating is a betrayal because games always involve commitments. well, multiplayer games do, basically promises to other people. And when you cheat, you break that promise to get an advantage. For similar reasons, my theory can explain why we resent the trifler, the guy who doesn't really try to win at all. They break a promise too. They break the promise to try to achieve the game's goal, to try to win, which could give us a nice challenge instead of just messing about and wasting our time. I also like the functional account in part because it explains why we use the same word, namely play, to characterize both playing a game and being playful. Playing full stop, as I sometimes put it. Those two don't entail one another. A kid rolling around on a hill is playing full stop but not playing a game. So you can be playful, basically, without playing a game. Equally, you can play a game without being playful, without having fun or enjoying it. In his autobiography, Andre Agassi revealed that he hated tennis with a deep passion and always has. That doesn't sound like someone being playful to me, but he was still playing tennis. Or think of Garry Kasparov, former world champion in chess, stressed out and deep in thought on the board, and tough position against Karpov. It would be kind of weird to say, when he was all stressed out like that he was being playful. He just seems too serious about what he's doing to count as playful. So you can play a game without being playful, and you can be playful without playing a game. But it doesn't seem likely to be a total accident that we use the same word, namely play, in both cases, particularly since we find the same pattern of using the same word for games and playfulness in a bunch of other languages, which I document in the paper. My functional account of playing games offers a kind of explanation of this link. If one of the functions that makes a practice, that is a set of rules and goals that are related in the right way, count as a game, is that it offers a mechanism for a structured form of play full stop, that is a structured form of playful activity, then you get a kind of intelligible relation between playfulness and gaming without anything as strong as entailment. Another advantage of the functional approach is that it fits well with how we evaluate games. For something to be a good game, that is good as a game, it needs to fulfill the functions we associate with games well. The pluralist theory of the relevant functions provides more scope for the kinds of evaluations we make of games in this way. Suita's theory focuses a bit too much, or at least too exclusively, on achievement. Games have other functions. Finally, I argue in the paper that my approach can actually vindicate Wittgenstein's idea that play a game is a family resemblance phrase, but only on a particular interpretation of what makes something count as a family resemblance phrase. This is partly because of the subtle shift in meaning between talk of multiplayer games and talk of single-player games. But it also is partly true because of the way in which play a game is up for negotiation, what Michael Pelczar, in his nice paper on family resemblance terms, calls semantic openness. For example, so-called sandbox games like Minecraft seem like games in some ways, but not in others. And we could have chosen to extend the word game to cover it or not. The way in which the term games extension to new cases is governed by precedent and crisscrossing similarities fits quite well with Wittgenstein's idea, at least on one reading, and that also fits well with my theory. But that's a kind of long story, and this interview's probably gone on long enough.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I think that was very interesting. And if what you say at the end is right, then there is a sense in which you're trying to get the best of both suits and Wittgenstein in their own framework.
Yeah, I steal a bit from both of them and try to make something better.